All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Vincent, the Executive Director of the Education and Civil Rights Institute, to get us started.
Thank you, Ms. Lockington. It is an honor to join this distinguished panel and leaders of this very important initiative. I'm going to start by introducing the Provost of the University of Kentucky, Dr. David Blackwell. Dr. Blackwell has been not only an outstanding academic leader on campus, he has been a steadfast supporter of equity and justice. He has been a supporter of diversity initiatives here on campus, and by definition, extension, the state of Kentucky and beyond. And we are honored to have Provost Blackwell and to make some opening remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Vincent. I really do appreciate the opportunity, especially since this is at least one of the earliest events co-sponsored by the College of Education and the NAACP Equity and Education Initiative. I was very excited about the idea for this initiative when we were in the recruiting process for Dean Vasquez-Heilig. I remember being excited by his ideas, and very early on during his deanship, he recruited an outstanding leader for executing these ideas, Dr. Vincent, and we are honored to have Dr. Vincent on our campus. And he has also brought in a number of other colleagues from his college and around campus to participate. Dean Vasquez-Heilig, you've had a tremendous impact on our campus in a very short time. And I just want to congratulate you for getting this initiative off the ground, and for your colleagues for pulling together to execute on an initiative that I think not only will improve the climate at the University of Kentucky, improve the educational outcomes of the University of Kentucky, but will also have far-reaching implications for equity in education in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, but then also all over the country. And I think that is the spirit of the collaboration with the NAACP, is that this initiative have a nationwide impact. This program in particular, I looked over the outline of topics. It comes at an excellent time. There are so many things going on in society that are difficult to and challenging to have discussions about with each other, but also with our students and with younger people in general. I think this topic is really timely, and I know myself, I'm challenged in some of these conversations myself. I try to learn every day. Sometimes the best I can do is just express some empathy. But I know that this will be a productive panel today, and I just want to thank all of the participants, the panelists, and I wish you a very engaging experience today. And I just want to welcome everyone on behalf of the University of Kentucky. Thank you, Dr. Vincent. I might stay on for a little while until I have to leave for another meeting, but thank you for allowing me this opportunity.
Thank you, Provost Blackwell. And again, we know that you are leading our campus into some very trying times, including trying to promote learning while we're also dealing with a worldwide pandemic. So thank you for your leadership on that as well. It is truly my honor now to introduce the Dean of the College of Education, Dr. Julian Vasquez-Heilig. Dr. Heilig, throughout his entire career, has been not only a public intellectual, he has also brought truth to power. His scholarship, his teaching, his service has all been designed to promote equity for all, from K-12 all the way through college and beyond. He has influenced policy in multiple states. He has been a leader and a volunteer with the NAACP, our distinguished partners, and now a very successful academic leader. And we're just so fortunate to have him. And now we're going to turn it over to Dean Heilig for his opening remarks.
Hello, how are you doing? We're just so excited that you've joined us for this important webinar. My heart ached when I heard about Breonna Taylor here living in Kentucky. My heart ached when I heard about George Floyd. My heart ached every single time that we experience one of these traumatic events. And so today we've put together a set of experts here at our brand new collaboration with the NAACP, the University of Kentucky College of Education, Education and Civil Rights Initiative. It's a first of its kind initiative. And in this spirit, we want to be community engaged and community relevant. So we put this podcast together today, or webinar, I guess I should say, specifically for young people, for teens. How do we deal with that heartbreak, that ache that we feel inside when we hear about these horrendous tragedies? And so we've gathered together some incredible scholars, and we're just so appreciative that you're here. But I want to say this too. I want to say that here at the University of Kentucky College of Education, we are champions for change. We are committed to making a difference in our nation and in our state. And so we want you to think about becoming an educator, being on the front lines of these, addressing our nation's challenges. Consider coming to the University of Kentucky. We're one of the top 30 ranked public colleges of education. We want you here with us at UK. So without further ado, let me hand the mic back to Dr. Greg Vincent, our esteemed executive director of this new civil rights initiative, so we can continue the day.
Thank you, Dr. Heilig. We are so very fortunate here in the College of Education at the University of Kentucky to have some distinguished scholars, academic leaders, persons again who've given their teaching, scholarship, and service to further the public good, particularly in the arena of public education. And let me do some introductions. We first have Dr. Candice Hargens. Dr. Hargens earned her PhD from the University of Georgia, and she directs the RISE research team, Relationship, Intimacy, and Sexual Enrichment, Race, Intersectionality, and Social Justice Engagement, where they study sex, social justice, and leadership, all with a love ethic. Recent projects have included the Healing Racial Trauma Project and Studying Sexual Narrative of Black Students. Her work has been featured in various media, including the New York Times, Huffington Post, and Therapy for Black Girls. Again, there's so much to read, but I will end to say that Dr. Hargens is an American Psychological Association fellow and is a licensed psychologist specializing in sex therapy and healing racial trauma. We are also fortunate to have Dr. Cheryl Matthias. Dr. Matthias was recently awarded the 2020 American Educational Research Association Mid-Career Award for her work on racial justice in teacher education. She is a professor and director of secondary teacher education at the University of Kentucky. Her research focuses on race and ethnic studies in education with a theoretical focus on critical race theory, critical whiteness studies, critical pedagogy, and feminism of color. She is a former teacher, both in South Central, the Los Angeles Unified School District, and in Bed-Stuy, the New York City Public of Education. She earned her bachelor's degree in cultural communication from the University of California, San Diego, a teaching credential at San Diego State, her master's in social and multicultural foundations at Cal State Long Beach, and her doctorate at UCLA. She is a distinguished author, has written 2 books that's been recently nominated and is now completing her third book. So in addition to speaking truth to power, she's putting pen to paper. And on a personal note, and in one of the places we connect, she's an avid Lakers fan. So we appreciate that. As you can see, magic in the background. Ms. Carol Taylor Shim is a nationally known equity and inclusion practitioner and consultant with more than 15 years of experience in the arena of equity and inclusion and social and racial justice work. And she currently serves as director of the University of Kentucky Office of Equity and Inclusion and Social Justice. And under Ms. Shim's leadership, the center has strived to foster an environment for the entire campus, particularly for marginalized groups, and so that individuals are seen, valued, and equitably served by increasing the capacity of student affairs professionals to operate through an anti-racist, anti-oppression lens. She was a distinguished practitioner in the child welfare system for 18 years here in Kentucky. And let me also just give a shout out. As you can see in the background, she's a distinguished member of Sigma Gamma Rho that celebrated 98 years of excellence. It's part of the Divine Nine. And we saw just in the recent election, the power of the Divine Nine and how amazing women came out together to move for effective change and equity. Dr. Kenneth Tyler is a chair and professor, and he earned his PhD in developmental psychology from Howard University. Dr. Tyler has research interests with African American and ethnic minority student populations. His work spans topics such as culture and cognitive development, race and racism, identity development, school-based and community-based learning, and socialization processes, motivation, social attachment, and African American student development. And as you can see, we have a wealth of knowledge and wisdom with our panelists, and we're ready to impart that. And as the dean mentioned, this is about the youth. This is about young people. And although we know that you all are dealing in a very real, profound way, trauma, we want to meet you where you are, and we want to be sure that we give you some strategies for you, not just to cope, but to strategize and for you to use that in a peer mentoring friendship way where you can help others in your community. But it's always been about young people. Representative John Lewis said it so well right before his passing, that the power, you don't have to wait for permission to be involved and engaged. You have the right, you have the power to effectively change the trajectory of your communities, your schools, your families. And we're here today to help you navigate that. And so again, with these panelists, we look forward to doing that. And so what we're going to do throughout this process, I'm going to ask some questions to our panelists, and we also want to hear from you. And so through the chat session, and we have some other mechanisms, and let me just make sure I get we have the ability to ask questions. And so throughout the process, through the chat and other mechanisms, we're going to make sure that we hear from all of you. But, and right now we are going to start, and I'm going to ask the panelists and no particular order. I want to ask and really just think about where our audience is. Why does it hurt? And again, one of the things we talked about in one of our earlier sessions is that we're not going to sugarcoat these words. Let's be clear that Breonna Taylor was murdered in her home by state actors. There's no other way to put that. And so that is what's caused trauma. You're in your own home and you were murdered by state actors. How can we address and how can we deal with that hurt? And why do so many young people hurt in the Louisville community and beyond? And again, I offer that to our panelists.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. a part of the reason it hurts is because racism impacts us not just in hurt feelings, which many people might think it ends there, but in physiological response. That means how your body takes in that information. So you might see a video or even hear a story about Breonna Taylor's murder or about any other person that looks like you being murdered, and you notice a drop in your stomach. You notice your heart rate picks up. You notice you start sweating. You have a hard time breathing. Those somatic responses, those experiences in the body have long-term health consequences when we continue to be faced with these onslaughts of highly publicized instances of murders and violence against people of color. And for Black people and Black students, very often this is invalidated. And so people think you should get over it. And when you don't have an empathic response, a response where somebody's like, I feel you, I see you, I get you, I hear you, and you're experiencing that type of pain, it goes deeper. And it's not something that heals without someone being able to bear witness to it, to be in the game with you and to see you as a person who has been harmed.
Dr. Hargens, thank you so much. And of course, as a licensed psychologist, in addition to being a world-renowned scholar, we certainly appreciate that, and really being able to name in a clinical way the pain so many of us are feeling in our communities. I just want to, just as a logistical thing, because I do want to make sure we have an engaged panel. If you want to submit questions, you can submit questions at College of Ed, so all together, College of Ed, QA, so question and answer, so College of Ed, QA @gmail.com. College of Ed, QA @gmail.com, and you can also put it in through the chat. So, Dr. Hargens, you really laid out kind of that why that hurts clinically. Does anyone else want to share? I know many of you have worked in this area as well. Does anyone want to comment further as we move, before we move to the next question?
I feel it's like racial battle fatigue. You know, I think Dr. Hargen hits it right on the nose in that when trauma happens, the worst part of it is people not acknowledging it is a traumatic event. And it's almost a belittling move of white supremacy to always engage in these maneuvers, saying that a life lost, especially a Black life lost, is not one that is humanly worthy of mourning. And this is a very big issue because when we're trying to deal with humanity and existing in a life situation where your humanity is not even recognized, it becomes even more difficult to mourn a loss, to live with your humanity in a society that just refuses to acknowledge it. So it's twofold. You know, one, you're mourning this loss, but two, you're frustrated because you can't even express that mourning. And if you do, you're gaslighted to believe that that is unworthy of such mourning. So there's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of emotional complexities that are behind witnessing murders.
Thank you, Dr. Matias. Anyone else before we move on to the next question?
I would just like to add that we see ourselves in these situations. And so the fact that Breonna Taylor was murdered in her own home, waking from her slumber, you know, she's not even safe in her own home. That applies to all of us. And so I do think that the idea that this could happen to any one of us also adds an additional layer of hurt and pain and anxiety to an already awful situation.
That's such a powerful point, because one of the reforms that came out of this is the elimination of these no-knock warrants, right? And I think that one of the things we have to think about is protest, yes. We also have to make sure that we change policy and practice, and so that we can feel safe in our own homes, right? So I think that's so absolutely critical. Let me move on
Just going to
Dr.
add,
Tyler, please, Dr. Tyler.
I was just going to add, Dr. Vincent, that part of that invalidation that we feel occurs within context. Part of that validation that we feel by the actions of others occurs within context. And so it's very likely that part of that hurt is tied to where we are feeling like we cannot express ourselves, express that hurt. And oftentimes that is in a particular context, whether it's a classroom, a certain teacher's classroom, or certain school. The fact that this Black body was taken away from us and its politicalization, and therefore our inability to talk about it, it hurts to not be able to bring that into a context like a classroom where we're expected to have belonging and are expected to have high expectations for achievement, but at the same time, this very intimate and difficult piece of who I am and what I've experienced as a Black person, I can't bring into this space. I can't talk about it in this classroom. And when I talk about it, I'm either invalidated, my experiences are invalidated, or I get in trouble for talking about it. I'm told that I can't talk about it. That also, I think, frustrates the immediate hurt of knowing that one of us was taken away from us by the state.
Dr. Tyler, thank you so much. Before we go to our next question, we are so very pleased to introduce the dynamic president and CEO of the NAACP, the nation's oldest and preeminent civil rights organization. I can tell you from my own interactions and my own friendship with President Johnson, he is the right person for these times. He has led this organization with distinction, and we just wanted to give him a moment to give introductions and greetings and talk about this partnership between the university and the NAACP and its direct impact on Breonna Taylor and the work the NAACP is doing to help youth address this issue. President Johnson.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Vincent, and thank you, Dr. Heilig, for the opportunity just to say a few words. I hope our youth director, Tiffany Lofton, was able to join early. The NAACP, we are ecstatic around the partnership with the University of Kentucky, primarily as a result of the work of Dr. Heilig. He served as our state education chair in Texas, and when he moved from Texas to California, he served as our state education chair in California, where he had significant impact, not only in those states, but also in helping the NAACP inform our policy positions around providing quality education for all children, which is so critically important. And even in the midst of the last 12 years around the distractions dealing with charter versus public, at the end of the day, Black children and brown children were being denied quality education from both systems. And we must recognize that for what it is, because at the end of this process, our ability to ensure our communities, our young people who are born outside of their control in zip codes that have locked them into subpar public education opportunities, it would have a disastrous effect on our democracy looking into the future. Anytime you weaken the delivery of education to your citizens, you weaken the ability of your systems to be maintained with the level of equity that's necessary to grow into a future. And as we watched this summer's activities, the beautiful thing about it was the protests were peaceful by large part, and it looked like America. You had young, you had old, you had Black, you had white, all screaming the same factual statement that Black Lives Matter. A statement of fact, a value proposition, not a hashtag, not an organization, a value proposition. And that value proposition must be carried forward in everything we do to make sure that the social contract that we call the Constitution, that all men and women are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights, are held true in our public policy, and there is no more important set of public policies than there is around the delivery of quality, public, free education. There isn't any society on this globe that's succeeding that outsource the delivery of free, quality public education to the private sector. Whether you're talking about the Finland model or the Cuban model or the Canadian model or the Japanese model, you name the country that's excelling globally, we can point to the delivery of a free public education system. And for the NAACP to build out the relationship with the School of Education under the leadership of Dr. Vincent and Dr. Hennig is important because we are an advocacy organization to advocate for public policy. And what this relationship is to build the policy frame for our members on the ground to advocate for, to push forth that notion of that value proposition, that factual statement that Black Lives Matter. Because we know the history of this country, if we value the lives of Black folks, that means the lives of all communities will be impacted in a positive direction. So thank you for the opportunity for saying a few words. And I don't have to speak on the issue of Breonna Taylor because it's self-evident that she was murdered. The value of her life was not considered. The kangaroo grand jury was unjust, irregardless of the state AG being of the same community. But Zeronel Houston said it very clearly, all of our skin folks ain't our kin folks. And the value proposition of that our lives, that her life matter, was undermined in that grand jury proceeding. So we have so much more to work to do, but it's the work that we must do in order for that social contract that we read in the Constitution that we all live under, that all of us, male and female, young and old, Black and white, Latino, everybody, are endowed with certain inalienable rights. And those rights should be respected. So thank you all.
President Johnson, as always, thank you. And thank you for being such an effective spokesperson and advocate for all communities, particularly as we deal with the twin pandemics of systemic racism and COVID-19. And you're, of course, welcome to stay. Panel, for our next question, Dr. Martin Luther King reminded us that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Change takes a long time, but it does happen. But for young people, it does beg the question, why does it take so long for real, effective, systemic change to happen?
I think that when you're young, you have the energy and you have the power, the sheer numbers to move change. And so even though the process might feel long suffering, we really rely on and have historically and currently rely on young people's energy to facilitate it, because the older you get, the more fatigue you feel with having been in the game for many years doing this work. And it's unfortunate, but to Dr. Mateus's point earlier, racial battle fatigue and racial trauma are real. So many of those of us who've lived for 35 years and 45 years and 55 years and 65 years did 25, 35, 45 years of work. And we have a lag. And we don't want that lag to impact you. That's why I love to embolden and empower young people to take it up at your school, to take it up in your communities. Because with your energy and commitment and enthusiasm and our knowledge of these systems and how you can dismantle them from the inside out, I think we could move faster.
Thank you, Dr. Hargens. Anyone else want to entertain that question?
Yeah, I'll just say white supremacy is resolute. it's resolute and it's obstinate. It will continue to evolve in ways that will make itself seem as it's important in all realms of our lives. And therefore, we really need to continue to be actively against, not just anti-racist, but something racially just, promoting an actual deconstruction of that. So why does it take so long for justice to take place? Because some people who benefit from the top are very reluctant into losing that privilege. And therefore, we have to, at some time, demand our needs and demand our presence in ways that get us where we need to be, a more equitable society.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists?
I would just encourage students to, and thank you, Dr. Matias and Dr. Hargens, for your commentary on this. It's important for students to recognize their role in the dismantling of this white supremacist structure that has been going on for so long. And that's where education comes in. It's important for you all as students, high school students in particular, to understand that your academic excellence is a form of resistance, is a means to which you are able to address and deconstruct these systems of oppression. A lot of this has gone on for centuries because it is tied to our, and by our, I mean Black people, it is expected that we are just going to fold within the system and accept it as it is. When the reality is, the more we learn about the system, the more capable we are of disrupting it and ultimately disconstructing this system. So it actually requires a lot of students, just like we were as students, some time ago. Our job was to look at these systems of oppression and begin the dismantling of that by doing well in school, by learning, literally by making sure that our academic excellence was not only tied to what we did for GPAs and getting into college, but we did on behalf of our communities in the dismantling of this white supremacy structure that has been around for such a long time and has been so obstinate. A lot of what will be required will be tied to what we do in classrooms.
Thank you. Any of the other panelists? Okay. So the next question, and we've touched on it, but I think it bears some more attention. How do I focus on school while trying to process racial traumas?
I'll take that. My research focuses primarily on teachers, which we know, according to the National Educational Council of Statistics, that 82% of them are white teachers. So the question is, how do I focus in school while trying to process racial traumas? I think it creates a burden for students to presume that they have to process this on their own. So, and I think one of the note here is that oftentimes Black, Indigenous, people of color feel the need to shoulder this burden in ways that precisely because they're never given credence to this reality, right? So my research focuses particularly on teachers, right? How are they adequately prepared to engage in the racial realities of the majority of the students that they teach? Let's be real. Most teachers, that 82% of white teachers, teach in the US a majority of students of color. And in acknowledging that, the racial realities of students of color should be acknowledged and respected, and therefore teachers should be prepared to deal with racial realities, yet this is not the situation at hand. Because oftentimes when we're talking about racial traumas, there's also something on the other side of racial traumas, that which aggresses, that which transgresses, which trespasses in ways that are felt as trauma. So to really understand two sides of the racial coin, we're understanding not only the racial traumas, but teachers themselves need to understand how racial traumas are produced. How do they engage in racial microaggressions, even through the process of silencing this discussion in their very own classroom, as if history and what they teach has no relevance to the lives we live today. And in general, if the teachers cannot make those connections to past and present, to content, to reality, they're not doing their job. So plainly stated, I know they're saying, what can we do to process the racial, the traumas, is one thing is to recognize this is not a burden that you should shoulder on your own. That's much of the responsibility, especially for students, especially for our youth, should not be on them. The adults that are present in their life have responsibilities, commitments that they need to follow through with. So please, as we're going to process this, don't believe that you're the only one that needs to be engaged in this process. Hold others responsible.
And to add on to Dr. Matias, the work that we're doing out of my Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Social Justice here at UK, we recognize the necessity of building the capacity of folks who are in service to students, folks who take care of students. There is a learning curve for those folks that is very specific around the issues of racial trauma and the ways in which they need to show up for the students and the communities that they're responsible for. And so while I definitely agree with everything that Dr. Mateus has said about, not feeling this necessity to be the only one, or that you have to navigate that, on the other side of it, I do think that there's an obligation for all of these environments, all of these institutions and these systems that are serving, that are taking care of our young people. Those folks in those systems have an obligation, have a moral obligation, I think, to do what they need to do to understand how this shows up. What do you say? What are things not to say? Students need that. And they need that so much more now because they're exposed to so much all the time. And so for me, in the work that we do in our office, it really is about building the capacity of instructors, TAs, resident advisors, everybody who has a role in creating that environment for students.
Thank you.
Can I add to that? I just, Miss Taylor Shim really hit something. I'm just gonna be real with you all. The expectation that our children need to take upon their own racial trauma is disgusting, straight up. I mean, I'm coming from Colorado, at University of Colorado, after 10 years, and we all know that in Columbine, one of the most prevalent, most infamous school shooting happened there in Columbine High School. Yet we didn't ask white children to deal with their own trauma about what the situation that had happened on their campus or in their communities, right? So why is it that we expect Black and brown children who are experiencing daily atrocities of racism to deal with their own trauma? These are our children. And so it's really disgusting. In fact, it's lazy. And I'm going to point out adults and going to implicate all of us here that it is unfair to presume that our children should deal with this on their own. They are children. And at the same time, I say they need to step up, not the children, all of adults who are in the building. So their silence is their complicity straight up to white supremacy.
Thank you. Representative John Lewis, in one of his last public appearances, connected directly with young people. And as Dr. Tyler mentioned, he did this during the peaceful protests of the murder of George Floyd, again, by state actor, the police, who were sworn to protect us, but took lives. And he implored young people to get involved, to get engaged, and in his classic phrase, get in good trouble. And so how can we empower young people and ourselves? Because Dr. Matias is so right. It is on all of us, and particularly those in authority and responsibility, to educate and to empower. How can we help our young people? Because they've already been engaged, but to be even more effective in their civic engagement.
I wanted to say that I feel wholeheartedly where Dr. Matias and Dr. and Dr. Taylor Shim are coming from. And I also have to add that to the point about how insidious these systems of white inferiority complex operate, I do not expect, and I think it would be irresponsible for me to pretend like we don't have power. And that includes children, and that includes Black and Brown parents and community members, those of us who don't have children. It's still our responsibility, because even though they should, because they created these systems, they have investment, are paid by the systems, are benefiting from the systems. It wouldn't make sense for them to relinquish these entitlements. And I don't expect that. And so I always add in the piece. I think those who are allies and who are doing that work, you need to continue. But I always add in the piece that remember who you are and what your power is. Because one of the myths of racism in that we are waiting for someone to save us. And actually, we don't need that. Actually, as people of color, we can come through and transform this system. We saw it with Black women transforming the way that Georgia flipped and Pennsylvania. So I always want to highlight that even though it should be the responsibility of these systems, the fact is that I am not going to tie my liberation to somebody's whim. And so I just want to always add in that you are powerful, full of power, and in collective power, you can change this system. You have the power to do that. And I recommend that we hold both of those always at the same time.
Dr. Hargens, you hit on a point that I was going to make at the end, but it's so powerful and compelling. Let me just jump in very quickly. One of the most important stories about African Americans and people of color and the ways that we created enduring institutions that advocated and protected the permanent interests of our people. I gave a shout out to the Divine Nine and how those organizations advocated for our interests. We talked about the NAACP that's now a century old. But let's go a little further. Let's talk about the Black church, right? That has been around, at least in my faith tradition, the Black Episcopal Church has been around since 1792. Let's talk about historically Black colleges and universities that have produced so many distinguished individuals, most recently being, of course, Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. Let's talk about the Black press that told our stories in such compelling ways. Let's talk about Black business and Black advocacy organizations and youth organizations, right? When we talk about John Lewis and SNCC, you know, the Freedom Riders, those are young people. And so, Dr. Hargens, I just wanted to use that moment just to amplify your such spot on point. So thank you for that.
I think it's important to recognize that teachers are not operating in a vacuum either. So if we're talking about accountability, we're talking about teacher candidates who become in-service teachers, and they're likely invalidation of Black students' experiences. But I would argue that that's actually something that exists at an administrative level that is going to be a function of colleges of education. And what I mean by that is those teachers and whether or not they can understand Black pain is going to be tied to whether or not they got a degree in elementary or secondary education where they were charged with understanding Black pain. If that doesn't happen, we're sending them out there to do more harm with Black student populations, but that's not the teacher's fault. That is a function of what they didn't get in their colleges of education while in undergrad or graduate school. Dr. Matias brings up an important point, which to me acknowledges the prevalence of privilege, this idea that, of course, white students will be treated in that fashion. And Dr. Hargens brings about the point of, yes, we have to make sure that the responsibility is from within, because we cannot expect to have that same type of privilege that those students in Colorado get. But if we're just talking about Black education, we have to go beyond the teacher and the student here and think about where those teachers, who are the adults in the room, by the way, where they got their training from and how adequate it was to really address the traumas of Black students. Because unless College of Education, like UK, are ready to have that conversation, then we've answered the question that we posed in the beginning of why did this arc of justice take so long? It's taking long because we're engaging in inadequate training. Even at the teacher education level, teachers are only going to do what they're capable of doing by way of what administrators say can be done in their classrooms. So now we have to think about teacher or educational leadership. Now we have to think about who's sitting on a board of directors for a county school board. Now we have to think about what their superintendents are thinking and how they see Black bodies and Black minds. In the absence of that, we will continue to have this next conversation the second somebody else Black dies. I'm muting.
I just wanted to remind everyone that we will have a period for questions and answers. We encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A section, and the email that I shared earlier is collegeofedqa@gmail.com. collegeofedqa@gmail.com. As I expected, we have a number of questions, and because of the power and the wisdom of our panelists, we've alluded and we've touched on some of those issues, and we may come back to them to get a more full treatment of those. But I want to go to, and I'm going to kind of make this a two-part question, and I do want all of the panelists to weigh in. So the two-part question goes as follows. How does racial justice link with other justice initiatives? And part two, what is intersectionality? So again, I open it up to the panelists.
So for me with this question, racial justice issues are absolutely linked to other justice initiatives. If you're taking a look at issues around climate change, if you're taking a look at issues around accessible health care, if you're looking at issues around disability or accessibility, all of those identities, all of those issues intersect with Blackness. And so they're linked. They were always linked. And when we think about intersectionality, and I hear lots of folks, using that term in a real general sort of way, like I'm made up of a lot of things, but it is so much more than that. It really explains overlapping discrimination and oppression based on holding multiple marginalized identities. And so for someone like me who identifies as a queer woman of color, I am consistently dealing with racism, homophobia, sexism, misogyny, misogynoir, a host of things. And so all of those come to bear in my life at any particular time. None of those things take a day off, they all show up together. And so it's important that we understand that when you're talking about issues around disability and ADA compliance and those kinds of things, there are Black people, there are Indigenous people, and there are people of color who are part of that community. And so race and ethnicity and those identities are in every other social justice sort of an initiative. And so it's really, really critical that we don't leave people behind. And one of the groups that I always think about when we're talking about racial justice and an example of how groups get left behind are trans women of color. And so we see all of the energy around the murders of cisgender folks, of Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd, of Sandra Bland, like a host of folks. But we don't see that same kind of energy when it is Brooklyn Deshauna or Felicia Harris or Michelle Ramos Vargas or Mia Green or Ariane Burnett or Tony McDade, who are all Black trans people of color who have been murdered. And so if we're going to have true justice, we have to have true justice for all of the ways that Blackness shows up. And so that does include Black trans women And so what would this world look like if, when there's a murder of a Black trans person, if there's a murder of an Indigenous trans person, if there's a murder of a trans person of color, what would this world look like if we had that same energy that we have when it is a cisgender person? And so as a member of this community, and as somebody, again, who identifies as a queer woman of color, issues for LGBTQ folks or queer and trans people of color are just like this with issues of race. And so you can't separate those. And to separate those becomes oppression.
You said a word there, and I know we have some others who want to continue that, but I literally got chills when you read out those names, and we need to do that more regularly. We need to call those names out so we never forget. So thank you for doing that.
I think Ms. Taylor Shim just hit it right on the nose. Just to be, I don't know, straight up, forgive me, I'm from Los Angeles, so I may not have the Southernized discourse, but I'm gonna straight up say it, social justice writ large is a eunuch if it doesn't address racial justice, meaning it's ballless. Like it straight has no balls. If you're gonna talk about social justice this, social justice that, and never talk about race, then you got no ovaries. Straight up, you need the ovaries to talk about race, inclusive of racism, whiteness, and white supremacy. If you don't, I got no balls. So I'm just being realistic with you, because as Ms. Taylor Shim just acknowledge, like, if you think K-12 education, if you think issues of disability has no impact on Black and brown communities, that is ridiculous, because most children who get referred to special education are Black and brown males. If you're thinking that people who get put into lower tracks in K-12 education aren't typically people that are Black and brown, particularly maybe people who have multilingual abilities, and then they're categorized as limited English proficient. You're actually seeing, then you're not thinking of education as a racial issue, right? When you're thinking about achievement gaps, right? The truth is, it's a racial opportunity gap, right? Where other Black and brown students are not afforded the same opportunities that other students who are white and Asian American students are being privy to. So let's be very honest here. When social justice can't take up the issues of Blackness and whiteness and anti-Black violence, like dismissing the dialogues about Breonna Taylor in the classroom and seeing its relevance on the impact of a Black student achievement, they have no balls to directly talk about what is very important. Again, I apologize for my Los Angeles discourse.
No apologies needed. And to kind of pick up on this hoop theme that you got going, you took it strong to the hole. So I appreciate you doing that. See, there you go. There you go. I love it. I love it.
When we think about intersectionality as students, I want you to think about what happened once George Floyd or any Black person was killed. And I want you to think about whether or not that issue was discussed the very next day in your classrooms. When we think about intersectionality, we think about multiple identities that exist at the same time. That you are a Black student, that you are a Black male student, that you are a Black male or female heterosexual student, that you are a Black male able-bodied student. The problem here is that those are multiple intersecting identities. I just gave you at least 3 or 4 different identity components. The problem is that when you went to that classroom the next day, there was only an expectation of one of those identities to show up, and that was your academic identity. That was who you are as a Black student, or rather just student. And so all of the identities that converge, that exist within you, that you carry everywhere with you, the oppression comes about when you are no longer able to express those multiple identity components. On the other end of it, intersectionality deals with the fact that because we have these identities, it's important for us to acknowledge how our identities are also privileged as well as oppressed. As a Black man, I know that I participate within systems of sexism. I know that sexism exists because I simply did not understand or know about in this state. I did not know about Breonna Taylor until after George Floyd occurred. That incident occurred. And so there was a premium placed on male Black death, probably more so than female Black death, that I, as a Black man, have to acknowledge. I am a privileged Black male in the sense that I participate in a system of sexism. And I have to acknowledge that, just like we want white persons to acknowledge their participation in racism, if we're looking to end the isms, then first we have to acknowledge what our identities are, the multiple ones, and then acknowledge how they are linked to either systems of privilege or systems of oppression.
Dr. Tyler, thank you so much. Dr. Hargens, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond before we turn to the Q&A, and we may come back to questions depending on the time.
Sure. So every time I do trainings around anti-racism or racial justice or healing racial trauma, I walk through a privilege portfolio activity. And it's different than the privilege walk that many of you have probably participated in. But what it usually amounts to is that there's this non-exhaustive list of 15 privileged identities. And every time I do one in a room, at least 6 to 7 privileges have to exist before you can even get in the room to do this training. And if you think about your life, if you think about whether you identify as white or male or heterosexual or cisgender or able-bodied or neurotypical or middle class or tall or stereotypically attractive or college educated, all of these, and that's not the whole list. Most of the time, the people who are having the conversation in venues like this have quite a bit of privilege. I know I do. I have 11 out of those 15 privileges. Identifying as Christian, being born in the United States, speaking English, all of those are privileged identities. And so I love the construct that Kimberly Crenshaw presented us with on intersectionality, because she talks about the multiplicative, exponential impact of each of these marginalizations. But what I love about Patricia Hill Collins's work, when she, at the same time, around the same time as Kimberly Crenshaw, came with the matrix of domination, most of us are benefiting from that matrix of domination. And that's why we get so slowed down in this process. That's why we get so held up in this process, because if it's not exactly your marginalization, which is so rare in this world, if you are operating with so many privileges, then it's so easy to overlook it. It's so easy to gloss over somebody else's pain. So what I'm asking us to do, and I appreciate Dr. Tyler for naming male privilege, and I'll name my cisgender privilege and my Christian privilege and my straight privilege and my middle class privilege and all of these things that helped me get from subsidized housing projects, Dr. Candice, to Dr. Candice Nicole, all of these facilitators. We have to acknowledge those pieces if we're thinking about this complex system of intersecting identities of marginalization and privilege.
You know, we could have a whole session on intersectionality, and I thank you all for in such a concise and effective way, addressing, you know, those issues, and of course, so very spot on. Let me just say just a piece about the social justice movements. Again, citing the exception work of the NAACP, I've often shared with my students that 2 of the best attorneys in the history of the United States, Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, engaged in a legal strategy to dismantle Jim Crow segregation, and took us to the Brown decision. That served as the blueprint, that quest for racial justice, for a blueprint for so many other social justice, legal social justice movements. And I'm thinking particularly about the work that Ruth Bader Ginsburg did for women's rights. When I think about the work for environmental justice and for persons with disabilities and LGBTQ rights. And so there has been this blueprint, and what we're seeing now is that integration of that work and that recognition of that intersectionality. All of the work that these distinguished scholars talked about is relatively recent. I mean, even if you talk about, if you pinpoint critical race theory, Derek Bell's Interest Convergence, Harvard Law Review, that was 40 years ago. That was 1980, right? And so we got to own the fact that we're creating this blueprint and we're building on this as we speak, right? And so you all, and I invite again, young people to be involved, to take the powerful words of John Lewis and get into good trouble, engage with your communities, be those servant leaders that are so critical for your communities. And I think that's absolutely essential. So we have some really outstanding questions. And I want to go up to, there's a two-part question that I want to address. Okay, why is it not going all the way up to the, let me go up to this. So the question, and I do not why. So the question in spirit is, why is the Breonna Taylor case so controversial?
I'll just keep it short and sweet. This woman died for doing absolutely nothing except being Black. Whatever it is we can tie to her, or whatever it is they thought existed, in the moment her life was taken, she did absolutely nothing except be Black.
I'll just add that it shouldn't be controversial. It's representative. It is something that has historical and current precedence in the United States. It exemplifies the function of and the origins of how police states have operated in the United States. The controversy is imposed on it when people seek to dehumanize a dead person so that they can substantiate a claim for why she was murdered. And this goes, and I want to always make this point clear, this goes for people who actually did commit crimes too, because we have a legal system that says innocent until proven guilty. But our state actors have often acted as if that is not applicable to people of color. And so there shouldn't be a controversy. There should have been indictments that were robust. And the controversy is imposed on people who really want to rationalize and justify dehumanizing a person so that they don't have to feel bad about murdering her. That's what's controversial, that people can do mental gymnastics and use all types of slights in legal codes and misrepresentation and misinterpretation of the law to justify and to allow people to not have consequence for murdering someone in their home while they sleep. That's the controversy. But this is really exemplary in the United States. It's not rare at all.
Dr. Hargens, let me just make a quick point. I think one of the reasons why this is so controversial and hits so close to home was that it was so intimate, right? I mean, you're in your home, right? That's a whole different situation. So thank you for that. Any of the panelists, and then Dr. Hargens, I do have a question directly for you, but I wanted to make sure there were any other responses. Dr. Hargens, you have a question from one of our panelists, and can you speak on standardization?
Actually, you know who put me on to standardization? Dr. Kenneth Tyler. So we're co-authoring a paper together that he was leading. Would you mind breaking that down?
Yeah, can you repeat the question? I was texting my wife, who's a middle school teacher downstairs, and tending to my 3-year-old, and so
No,
I heard the
understand.
go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just speak on standardization.
Yeah, so when we think about everything that we operate within in this country, that it is normed based on the cultural experiences, the realities of a certain group that others come to accept because more often than not we have to, that is the standardization. And we don't often think about it because it is in fact the standard. You know, I've made a mental commitment not to wear neckties because wearing a necktie when you're being formal is a nod to the standard of how you ought to look. But that look is not necessarily aligned with what I think is a part of my cultural backdrop, my cultural identity. It is a fact, a nod to another cultural identity. There are standards that are created that we operate within that are not created by us, that are imposed upon us. When I say us, I'm talking about Black people. So we think about the standard of teachers in classroom. More often than not, K through 12 emphasizes the individual teacher as the dominant person in the room. And so that the goal there is to impart information in sort of this banking system that Paulo Freire talked about, so that the knowledge is acquired by this one person. And so that now is the standard. The question is, whose standard was it? Who believed that only one person possesses all of the knowledge to be imparted on the rest of everybody else? Where I come from, what I think is just as valuable as what other people think, especially teachers. Where I come from, there's a synergy between teachers and students so that there are two individuals learning as opposed to just one, where there's a simultaneous pouring or banking of information taken from the other. But the standard is individualism. The standard is this idea that there's a link, or rather that there's this operating modality that exists, and it is based on cultural values that aren't oftentimes reflective of those within Black communities. There are a lot of things that we do because it's the standard, and not necessarily because we agree with it, not necessarily because we value it. Standardization in a phrase is what you're doing and you don't know why you're doing it. And when you do it, there's a reflection of a certain cultural backdrop, a certain cultural ideology that oftentimes is not yours.
So, Dr. Tyler, we're going to have a discussion about that in another time as we talk about, development. And I do appreciate and respect the position of how do we own our own identity. I think that's absolutely essential. I want to give, go ahead, Dr. Tyler, I'm sorry.
I was just muting again.
Okay. I want to give a shout out to the incredible team that put this together. I want to particularly thank Marianne Lockington, who serves as the Chief of Staff for the initiative, and Beth Goins and Amanda Nelson from the College of Education Communication team. They have truly done an outstanding job, and we want to thank them for that. And the next voice you're going to hear is from Ms. Lockington, who, again, I'm always going to give her a shout out, who is an acclaimed author. She's written some truly outstanding work, and she is going to read out the questions so that we all can hear them and we all can have an opportunity to respond. Ms. Lockington.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vincent. We had a really wonderful question come in from a young person, and I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity to answer it a little further. So this question is, my school decided not to talk about what has happened all summer. No teachers are allowed to talk about Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and about everyone that has died from police brutality this year because they don't want to make students uncomfortable. Do you think schools deciding not to talk about this issue affects us as students because it has affected my ability to achieve in school?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it does. My research actually demonstrates the effect of vicarious racial trauma on Black students. And there's also research that complements that on the vicarious racial trauma experiences of Latinx students and Asian American students and Indigenous students. So absolutely. So some of those consequences are that you have a hard time concentrating, that you feel hypervigilant when you walk into the classroom, that you feel devalued, that you might experience higher levels of stereotype threat or feeling like imposter syndrome, like you don't deserve to be there, or you can't raise your hand. All of those are actual research-based evidence for why we should open up these conversations in the classroom. People who make a decision not to preserve comfort are really preserving the comfort of the global minority. And that's unfortunate. And it's a disservice to good education. It's a disservice to evidence-based education. And it's not a quality, high quality standard practice. And so maybe they should reconsider, your administrators at whatever that school are need to reconsider the policy on what should and should not be discussed in classrooms, especially if they want to see the advancement of all students.
Thank you, Dr. Hargens. Does any of the panelists want to respond?
I was just going to say quickly that in psychology, a lot of teachers are aware of this hierarchy, it's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when we think about our progression up the hierarchy, one of the main themes is physiological needs being met. That's the foundation. The second one is feeling safe. The third one is belonging. If I'm in a classroom where I cannot express feeling safe because literally the night before, a young woman was killed in her home, the next day, if we are not talking about that, then you are reminding me that I absolutely do not belong in this academic context, that who and what I am in my complete authenticity, all of my identities and their intersections do not have a space here. And from there, we can guarantee that your academic self-esteem will likely be lower. We can guarantee that your motivation to achieve will likely be compromised. And that's not because you're not smart. That's not because you're not motivated to do well. When students show up, they are letting you know as an instructor that you are there to do what you need to do. Showing up is all that a lot of students need to do. But most importantly, self-actualization is compromised now. We're now thinking about what it means for me to be an excellent student when this second and third level, the foundation to who and what I am, my belongingness, is not manifest. We're now talking about teachers who are compromising the self-actualization of students simply by dismissing the identities that in that moment were absolutely critical in terms of their ability to be addressed.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I always find it interesting when organizations or entities or leadership talk about we don't want to make people uncomfortable. And I think we all know who those people are that they don't want to make uncomfortable. A lot of the work that I do at UK affords me the opportunities to talk to people, students, staff, and faculty who are struggling, trying to navigate the ways in which their trauma is showing up. And all folks want is like to be believed, to be affirmed, and to be seen. And so when you're in a space as a student and you're trying to navigate all of this trauma and everything that comes with it, to not have that acknowledged is an injury. It is an assault. And then it continues to cause trauma. But I'm always just like, we know who folks want to keep comfortable. And it's often not folks who look like us.
Thank you.
And that's part of the work that I do. I didn't really want to focus too much. I did answer the question on the Q&A, so hopefully that was reached to Miss Karenga, who's asked that question. So I definitely hope that that resonates. We're talking about why administrators stay silent, and I like how people are saying because they're trying to keep the comforts of someone intact, and that's the whole issue of like white fragility, right? It's like it's almost as if you have to deal with someone who has almost like a hysterical response to just even dialogue about race. I mean, here Black communities are dealing with life and death situation. And then here you're getting particularly white communities, not only white communities, right? Who are dealing with, I just don't want to feel like I'm a racist. Having those two types of feelings are not equatable. One is sensationalized, one is tangible. And that's the kind of work that I do with my book. Like my first book, Feeling White, talks about that, how these emotionalities of whiteness embedded not only in white teachers. I want to be very clear that this can inhabit other systems, as Dr. Tyler was saying so poignantly earlier, that it's not just about the teachers themselves, but how these teachers are prepared, the entire system of education, right? We're talking from administrators, the preparation of administrators. We're talking about even teacher education programs and colleges of education. But we're also talking about the accreditation, the national accreditation companies, what they see is valuable in an accrediting and a teacher education. So we're seeing a larger systemic issue that makes it much bigger. But at the end of the day, when we can't even talk about the realities of how hurtful it is, how scary it is, for one of my closest friends to say, I'm afraid my son will be killed by police coming home from school. For her to say that is an existential reality. It's a reality here, and it's also an existential reality of what's happening in US America, right? This is a big issue. So the fact that we can't even talk about it, the realities, just because someone's sensibilities might be hurt, is not equatable. And I think that's the really big problem that we're engaging in. I really am not in the business of caring about if you feel scared to talk about race because there's other people feeling scared about living. So that's an issue that we really need to take up.
And I'll just do a quick shameless plug that because our primary audience for this is high school students, when you're making decisions about the next level within the education you pursue, it's important for you to really gauge the types of conversations, the discourse, what's happening at the university level that will ensure that you are being seen in the totality of your identities. If you don't want to go to a university that keeps you invalidated, that keeps you marginalized. In the College of Education, we're having these conversations in classes with our teacher education program students, with our graduate students. Research is occurring across all 7 departments in these areas. We are unafraid to really tackle this issue of what it means to engage in diversity, equity, inclusion work, especially on behalf of students of color, particularly Black students. And so I encourage you to start thinking critically about your next step in education and who are the individuals and institutions that are willing to have the conversations. The College of Education at the University of Kentucky is leading in that field. Each of the departments within it are leading in that field. I encourage you to reach out.
Dr. Tyler, let me amplify that point because you hit it right on the head. It was so critical that the chief academic officer of the university found it important, even dealing with COVID and so many budget issues. It was important for him to be part of this conversation to affirm his support of that. So I really appreciate that. And Dr. Matias, let me pick up on a really powerful point that you all made before we kind of go to our last question and final thoughts. You know, we all have acknowledged, or many of us in the legal realm have acknowledged that Brown versus Board of Education is the most important decision in modern American jurisprudence, right? Dismantling Jim Crow segregation. And as Professor Derek Bell did in his 1980 critique and applying a critical race lens, one of the things that the consequences of Brown and the decision in Brown is that it took the lens away from systemic racism and applied it to individual acts. It was almost as if, and along with the Civil Rights Act, it was, well, we've dealt with the racism, we dealt with discrimination. If discrimination happens, it's individual acts rather than powerful systemic acts of racist discrimination and inequity. And what the only silver lining in my mind from the murders of so many, you know, most notably Breonna Taylor, is that we put the focus back on systemic issues. Even if you don't consider yourselves individually racist, and back to Dr. Matias's point, well, I'm not racist. Well, you know, it's an affront that you do that. You still participate and perpetuate a system that that is so powerfully determined, this resoluteness that you talked about, to perpetuating racism and inequity. So I am, Ms. Lockington, if there's any other final question, and then I'd like the panelists to make some final thoughts before we adjourn.
Yes, absolutely. So I think this might be a good question. It's a two-part. So the first part is, Black women oftentimes are the last thought, but the first to the fight. How do those of you who identify as Black women keep going? So first question. And then for others, more than likely the people who need to hear this conversation that we're having here today are not in this room. So where do you all think we go from here as youth and as adults?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just say, if you, while you're answering that question, can you just incorporate your final thoughts, because after this we will adjourn. And I want to thank everyone, the participants, particularly the young people. We want to thank you for participating. This will be the first in a series of discussions as we connect with you. We promise this will not be a one-off. So again, panelists, thank you so much for your wisdom and your courage for coming forward. And please respond to the question and make your final thoughts, and then we will adjourn.
In Kamala Harris's United States of America, I can just say that for the next 16 years, I am committed, along with any other women who identify as Black women, to being not last, but putting myself first and putting Black women's issues first and advocating for ourselves first. Because when Black women are well, and let me just break it down, when Black queer women are well, then the world is well. And we orchestrate wellness for the rest of the community. So if we put ourselves first intentionally, then I think we have some real transformative power that will be an outcome of that, the butterfly effect of that. And so I invite everyone, even if you don't identify as Black women, to do good for, do right by the Black women in your world. And if you are a Black woman, divest from all of the things that told you that you should be last from here on. Because from 2021 on, I'm letting these last 2 months be a practice. We need to really invest in ourselves and invest in the things that bring us joy and make us feel loved and help us feel well, mental wellness, physical wellness, spiritual wellness, all of it, because that's going to have implications in the positive way for the rest of the world.
Thank you.
So ditto everything Dr. Candice Hargens just said. That was beautiful. What I would like to leave people with is this. Please don't leave other Black people behind who may not be the same as you. Please don't leave Black trans women behind. Please don't leave Black trans men behind. Please don't leave queer and trans people of color behind. We are here. We have always been here, and we will always be here. And so this movement, this work, this shift really has to be for all of us. And so please, please, please do not leave folks behind. For any queer trans students of color who may be on this webinar right now, I see you, you are valuable, you are worthy, and you can do anything in this world that you want to. So please live loud, live out, and live free.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, first of all, for the opportunity to be here. It's amazing. I toned myself down. So I think with this election, with everything that's going on, we feel like in some way, shape, or form that we're moving towards a way that we're being recognized. And I think it's very apropos to say that Black women continue to lead the way, and therefore it is so important that Black women take care, and put Black women first. This is what needs to be had long before Vice President Kamala Harris. I do want to say first, thanks to the youth, man. I don't even, you think you don't have agency, but I saw you in droves in every single city that sparked a global movement that Black lives do matter. You're getting respect in Norway. Like how many, like Black lives matter in Norway, right? So you know what I'm saying? Like, don't let them, in thinking about putting yourself first, don't let that mindset that Black people are last get to your notion of agency. You being here today is so inspiring. I wish we can continue to connect with the College of Ed here at UK, because you are what we need. Your presence shows that you care, and so when you're asking what can you do for you're already doing it, first of all, and second of all, you make the education for you. You know what I mean? If it is not your job to educate the teachers, you don't have to, but it is your job to make sure that you're getting the education that you receive that welcomes your wholeness, like what Dr. Tyler was saying, the belongingness, right? That you are seen in this moment in time. So if this is the link you need to forward to the teachers and your students, if you need to have these conversations, you grab it right now and you say, I'm gonna have it with the homies, right? With the homies in your school. Get the homies in the school. Say, you know what, I'm gonna make this space the talk right now. We're gonna do the talk. Black Lives Matter right here in this school. And so, move with it. You've already done it. You're already doing it in your homes. Honor that, respect that. I respect that. I love that. And continue to make that space. You're never gonna be given it, so take it upon yourself to make it.
Thank you.
There's a Black artist that I used to follow when I was on social media. His name is Ronald Draper. And he created a t-shirt for infants all the way through adults that said, "A Black girl will save the world." And on the one end, as a father of a 3-year-old girl, I thought, how powerful is that statement? And on the other end, I thought about how incredibly pressurizing that statement is, to place the fate of the world in the hands of Black women. And that is the expectation. So my job is to make sure that I'm supportive of Black women. As Dr. Hargens said, once Black queer women make it, then the world makes it. But their making it is going to be tied not to just systems of oppression that are tied to communities that aren't like us, but also systems of oppression right here within our own communities when we think about the realities of Black women. We have to understand as Black men what our role is in our support of Black women, and make sure that we're checking our male privilege when trying to support Black women. And we only do that once we start the introspection process ourselves. Once we're trying to get a better idea of why I have these mindsets, these ideologies about who and what Black women are to me, and change them so that Black women can in fact change the world, then we're doing our part. In Kamala Harris's America, there were more Black men who voted for the other party where a Black woman wasn't on the ticket than 4 years before, 8 years before. And so there's something about this within our own communities that has to be addressed. And the only way that all of us move forward in Kamala Harris's America is if we understand what it means for our identities to be in support of Black women, their identities, and their vision for the collective future. That said, I encourage you to keep empowering yourselves. I encourage you to keep having the difficult dialogues. If for nothing else, practice. I encourage you to consider the University of Kentucky as the place where you want to continue to have the dialogues, because we're already having it. I've been having this with some of you all's teachers for about a decade now. My goal is to make sure they come into the spaces that you occupy with at least an understanding of the multiple identities that you bring to the table. We're doing the work. We want you to join us in the work and help us make it even better. Because as was mentioned by all of the panelists, our future collectively is tied to what we are to you. And then what you do with the knowledge that you help us impart, the knowledge that you give us so that we're creating a better tomorrow.
I'm going to make one quick point before we let Ms. Taylor Shim close us out. One of the real responsibilities that we have as men is to mentor our young men and boys in this full context of this, and dare I simplify, to be feminists, right? To be able to understand, these issues. And it's our solemn responsibility in the organizations, at least I'll speak for the organization I belong to. Every part of that is how do we grow up the next generation, and particularly how do we respect, value our women. And it's not just what we say, it's what we do, right? And so, Dr. Tyler, thank you so much. And again, I want to end by Dr. Shin, and then she will be the last voice you hear, and then we will sign off. Ms. Taylor Shin. I
love how y'all keep calling me doctor. I'm gonna claim that. I appreciate that. Let's just name that. It will happen sooner than later. But really what I would just like to leave folks with is really recognize the power that you have. There's so much power in being Black. There's so much power in claiming Blackness. So don't be afraid of that. The other thing that I would ask folks who may not identify as Black that are involved in this webinar right now, really explore your options and the ways in which you can be an accomplice. Allies are great, but at this stage of the game, we really, really need some accomplices. And accomplices are willing to engage in some risk, and they do that at the behest of the folks that they are advocating for. And so I really, really encourage folks to check in on what kind of person you want to be in this world. Do you want to be a person who sits by silently while other people are hurt? Or do you want to be somebody that is part of this movement that is going to change everything for everybody? We can do that. We have to do that. So I thank everybody who is here. I'm so grateful and so appreciative to be in this space with such phenomenal people. And so thank you all. And again, for queer and trans people of color, live free, live loud, live always.